Welcome to Nexdigm podcast. My name is Sundar. I lead the forensic services at Nexdigm. This podcast is a global anti-corruption series. Our podcast is an endeavor to bring up emerging topics of relevance for executives across spectrum of services we offer. Hope you enjoy the podcast. Across the geographies, regulatory environments are changing, business practices are changing, and behaviors are changing with COVID. Anti-corruption in the current environment is bringing newer dimension of issues around supply chain, healthcare, and other reporting requirements. This also extends to regulatory interventions and the whole new virtual world. In this podcast series, we will be interviewing specialists across regions to gather specific insights on anti-corruption in current times. The region that we would like to get covered today is LATAM. Today we have with us Leopoldo. Leopoldo is a partner with FreitasLeite. He is in charge of antitrust, anti-corruption and compliance practices. He is currently the chair of Anti-Corruption Committee of International Bar Association. He was also considered as one of the 40 under 40 professionals by Global Investigation Review in the category of internal investigation. Leopoldo, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Sundar, for your introduction. It will be a pleasure to talk to you today and to throw lights about Brazil and what's going on here in our region.
Perfect. And that's really interesting to have you in this, Leopoldo. To start with, I know that the region has been really a center point for a number of initiatives in the recent past, including corruption-related enforcements per se. How do you perceive the corruption risks in the current environment in the region? That will be really helpful.
Well, as you pointed out, in the past years, there were some changes in enforcement. 10 years ago, it was nearly non-existing, and now we have a very strong enforcement, especially in Brazil and in some other jurisdictions like Peru and Colombia. But when it comes to the current situation, I think that it's still very early to make a proper assessment and also to make predictions. Of course, there are several factors impacting on the risks at the moment, but there are some situations which have become quite clear. For instance, when it comes to public procurement in health care, the risks have grown dramatically due to this COVID-19 crisis. There have been a lot of emergency procurement rules which were laxed, and as a result, the proceedings in biddings brought down several formalities which existed to guarantee the effective competitiveness and reduce the risk of corruption. Of course, that the corrupt officials and businessmen see this as a good opportunity for their business, and of course in the future they have a very good defense. They will say, well, we sold these products or these medicines to the government at this high price because there was no competition, because it was an emergency, so they have a very good justification ahead. Also, many contracts were entered under the edges of emergency. This means that some of them necessarily were tainted with corruption. As we speak, probably there is something wrong going on in my country and in Latin America. In fact, the police has actually unveiled several cases in the past couple of months, and we're talking about a pandemic that started just 3 or 4 months ago. So take the case of the state of Pará in the Brazilian Amazon. It's in the north of the country around the equator region. The state is famous for being one of the most corrupt in Brazil, and it was seriously hit by the pandemics at the beginning of the situation here in Brazil around March, early April. The governor, who belongs to a family who has been involved in politics in the state for several decades, has a not very good reputation actually. What happened? they needed to get supplier for ventilators. Due to COVID-19, people have breathing problems and they need ventilators, mechanic ventilators. Well, they paid royally a couple of one specific supplier. Actually, the price was 5 or 6 more times than it's normally paid in other circumstances, and they actually received the ventilators. But there was a tricky part. The ventilators that came from China were not meant for people but for animals. So this shows how the risks are taking place here in Brazil at the moment. It's a very difficult situation for people doing business with the government in healthcare, in the healthcare industry.
I really understand that, Leopoldo, and specifically when you mention about government procurements, and at this point in time we're dealing with lives, and many of these procurement transactions are going to have a direct impact on livelihoods and also saving lives in the healthcare segment. I think that's a very valid point to put across, where there is going to be an increased risk of corruption in the government sector, where there is procurements that are going to be made by the government themselves, and if there are intermediaries who are going to be supplying those materials by procuring it from other geographies, that is going to be subjective to the challenges of corruption in the current times. I think that with that, I just wanted to extend it to this interesting point. Now, you also touched upon the government procurement side, where emergency procurements are activated at this point in time. Are you seeing there is an increase in government touch points? So, for example, earlier, we used to have companies which were reporting only on tax-related basis. Now, they have stimulus packages, they have interfaces relating to healthcare, there's procurement transactions. These additional touch points with government, does this expose an organization to corruption risks in LATAM?
Yes, definitely. Every time you are in touch with government, you are subject to risks related to corruption. Although I suspect that these kind of incentives are heavily regulated and they do not automatically create an opportunity for corruption. I mean, there may be, but it is not so straightforward. In the past, there were some tax incentives, as you reported, but they were specific, they were sector specific, like, for instance, for the car industry, manufacturing. Several years later, it has become evident that there was some corruption behind those specific tax incentives. So when it comes to these widespread tax benefits which are conceded to entire economy, I believe that the risks of corruption are smaller, but even so they exist. Take, for instance, the emergency pay which is being given to poor people in Brazil. There was an emergency pay of $150 US dollars. And as a result of that kind of payment, the government has made use of publicly available database. And even so, there were people who were taking advantage of the situation and defrauding the scheme and getting paid several times. So this kind of situation always leads to corruption risks, but I believe that this is not necessarily the situation for the companies which may be interested in Brazil.
I clearly understand. To just extend it from there, you did mention about compensatory pay that the government is paying for select individuals, and how there are corruption issues that are coming along in there. So what I was actually saying was that at this particular point in time, if we are saying how do we see remote working, lockdown related factors and relaxation thereof, and the healthcare focus impacting the country at this point in time?
Well, remote working is a reality which has already been going on for some years for some companies in Brazil. I have a company which is a client in the healthcare industry, which has 20% less working places than employees, meaning that once per week they were already doing the remote working home office. Of course, this is how can I say, a new trend for most companies. On the other hand, I think that at at the beginning, it's unclear to say that there will be more compliance or anti-corruption risks arising from this remote working. Of course, that intuitively you may say, well, it will be hard to supervise the employees, the sales teams. That's true. But on the other hand, if the company has a very solid ethical environment, this should not be a problem. But on the other hand, I am afraid that there are matters which cannot be dealt remotely. For instance, internal investigations. You can't just walk away from the office where there is a controlled environment and places where people are not circulating, they are not coming to see what they're doing. So I think that there will still be situations which will require presential work in the office.
I completely understand. You made a very valid point in terms of how the scenario is different in internal investigations matter, and how companies' remote working culture also drives things more appropriately. What's more important at this particular point in time is that whether it is risks that are caused by the current remote working environment or the healthcare focus, as the case may be, the issue is more about how do you see regulators looking at this? Do you see regulators taking up active enforcement action, or do you see them looking at passive enforcement actions at this point in time?
Well, that's a good question, and I would say that's a $1 million question. If I do, I think that I would be racing ahead my competitors. Unfortunately, it's very hard to see the trends of regulators. I think that, generally speaking, in Brazil, the regulators tend to follow the main trends. So if there is global enforcement in the airplane manufacturing industry, they will target this industry. If there are concerns in health care procurement, they will follow this trend, and also they will follow the existing investigations. For instance, when it comes to car wash, the largest anti-corruption investigation probe in Brazil, everything started with an anti-money laundering investigation in a small town in the north of, or in the south of Brazil, and they pulled a thread, and everything that came after that was a huge anti-corruption scandal. And what we have seen so far in the past 2 months in relation to the crisis caused by COVID and the anti-corruption enforcement shows that the regulators the enforcers are targeting exactly the most striking cases of wrongdoing. For instance, cases where not only in terms of value, when you look at, they spent $100 billion in ventilators, but wait, what's the price of to buy that amount of ventilators? How much would it cost? Probably $10 million. So they are paying attention to those huge differences. Also, they will probably target construction of emergency hospitals, which has been a very serious problem. Some of them have not yet been delivered, they completed, but they were paid in advance. So they were paid 3 or 2 months ago, and they're not yet over. So probably they will be completed after a cure of the disease is found. So this is not strange in Brazil, where we still have underground lines under construction, which were meant to be ready for the World Cup in 2014.
I can really understand. So you're basically saying that there are certain industries which will have impact, and there are certain industries which will evolve over a period. And more interestingly, the regulators are going to be looking at critical cases, which could either be in terms of value or in terms of criticality of the nature of issue that we are speaking about and the significance of impact that it would have for the general public. To just extend that further, I just wanted to ask you, in this very, very dynamic scenario, what are the three things that you suggest to a compliance officer to consider?
Well, three things. It's a very long list. At the moment, it's very hard to see what they can do, especially considering that their budgets have been seriously impacted. You know that they are. I've been talking to some clients, and rather than speeding up projects which were being procrastinated just because they did not have time, now they have to slow down because they have no budget at all. So perhaps the first unintended victim of this COVID-19 crisis is the compliance area. But I've been talking to compliance officers in Brazil, and I'm telling them that they should try to focus on the not so expensive or not so urgent matters which have been left aside. For instance, due diligence on some suppliers, or then think about a risk assessment which was not essential, and it was considered, it's something good to do, but not at the moment because we are very busy, or there are other priorities. So generally speaking, these are the advices I've been giving to compliance officers. More specifically, if they are doing business with healthcare, and because there are a lot of emergency contracts, I've been telling them that they should perform a due diligence on the buyer. This sounds a bit strange at first, but as we are dealing with state entities, we should look at how they get the authorization to retain the services of or buy the products that they are looking for buying. I mean, you must look at the administrative laws and check and confirm whether they have been complied with. So basically, this is what I have been talking to the clients lately.
So you're basically speaking about the issues of aligning to the essentials, so to say, whether it is in terms of due diligence, in terms of risk assessments, or whether it is in terms of validating realities on ground. I think this is going to be very insightful for the listeners. And thanks a lot for joining in this show and then sharing your perspective, Leopoldo. I really appreciate you joining, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Yes, thank you, Sundar. It was a great pleasure, and please feel free to reach me whenever you need for other initiatives.